Elara Vance stood on the auction block wearing her mother's threadbare dress, her future being bartered for $50 and a handshake between men who wouldn't meet her eyes. The rancher buying her hand in marriage was deaf, twice her age, and had the coldest stare she'd ever seen. But worse than that, she'd just learned this wasn't desperation that brought her here. It was entertainment, a bet. And she was the prize nobody actually wanted. If you want to see how a woman sold like livestock becomes the only person who can save the man who bought her, stay until the end. And hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The general store smelled like tobacco and leather, and the kind of quiet shame that settled into wood after too many difficult conversations. Elara kept her hands folded in her lap, nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. Across the room, her father shifted his weight from boot to boot, hat crushed between his hands like he was wringing out a confession. "It's the only way," he said for the third time. She didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that would make this feel like anything other than what it was. The man buying her, because that's what this was, no matter how they dressed it up with words like arrangement and agreement, sat in the corner with his back to the wall. Rowan Cade. She'd seen him in town maybe twice in her life, always alone, always moving through the streets like he was passing through a place that didn't belong to him. He was older than her by at least 15 years, maybe more. His face had the kind of hardness that came from weather and silence, lines carved deep around his mouth and eyes. His hair was dark, streaked with gray at the temples, tied back in a way that felt practical rather than stylish. He hadn't said a word since walking in. "He can't hear you," the store owner said quietly, leaning against the counter. "Been deaf since he was a boy. Some kind of sickness, they say." Elara's father nodded like he already knew. Maybe he did. Maybe that was part of why this arrangement had come together so easily. Rowan Cade didn't need a wife who could talk her way out of things, or charm neighbors at Sunday socials. He needed someone to cook and clean and exist quietly on the edge of his property, and her father needed $50 before the bank took the farm. The math was ugly, but it balanced. Rowan's eyes flicked toward her just once. They were dark, unreadable. She tried to hold his gaze to show him she wasn't afraid, but the truth lodged itself in her throat like a stone. She was terrified. "All right then," her father said, his voice cracking just slightly. "We're agreed." The store owner produced a piece of paper, something official-looking with cramped handwriting and spaces for signatures. Rowan stood, moved to the counter with the kind of economy that suggested he didn't waste movement on anything unnecessary. He signed his name in a sharp, angular script, then stepped back. Her father signed next. His hand shook. When the store owner slid the paper toward Elara, she stared at it for a long moment. This was the last chance to say no, to refuse, to walk out of here and face whatever consequences came with letting her family fall apart. She picked up the pen. Her signature looked small next to the others, almost childish. When she set the pen down, the store owner folded the paper and tucked it into a drawer like he was filing away a receipt. "Congratulations, Jonas," he said, said, and it sounded like condolence. Rowan didn't wait for pleasantries. He walked to the door, pushed it open, and stood there with his back to the room, waiting. Elara looked at her father one last time. He wouldn't meet her eyes. She followed Rowan into the street. The wagon was hitched outside, a flatbed thing that had seen better years. Rowan climbed up into the driver's seat without offering her a hand. She pulled herself up onto the bench beside him, skirts tangling around her legs, and sat as far to the edge as she could manage without falling off. He snapped the reins and the horses started forward. They rode in silence through town, past the church and the schoolhouse, and the row of buildings that made up what people generously called Main Street. A few faces turned to watch them go. Mrs. Calloway from the boarding house, old Peter Grimm, who spent his days on the bench outside the farrier's shop. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to pity, and Elara felt the weight of both like stones in her pockets. No one waved. The road out of town was rutted and dry, dust rising in pale clouds behind the wagon. Elara kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, watching the way the land stretched out flat and endless in every direction. This was the kind of country that didn't forgive mistakes. You either learned to survive it, or it buried you. Rowan's ranch appeared slowly, rising out of the emptiness like something grudging. The house was small, built from rough timber that had weathered to gray. The barn was larger, more cared for, with a corral stretching out to one side where a few horses stood flicking their tails at flies. There were chickens scratching in the dirt near the porch, and a dog, some kind of rangy mutt, that lifted its head as they approached, then settled back down without much interest. Rowan pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down. This time he did offer a hand, though it felt more like obligation than courtesy. Alara took it, his palm rough and calloused against hers, and stepped down onto ground that would apparently be hers now. He gestured toward the house with a tilt of his head, then walked past her to start unhitching the horses. She stood there for a moment, waiting for something, an instruction, an introduction, anything, but he didn't look back. After a long pause, she climbed the porch steps and pushed open the door. The interior was dim, the windows small and the curtains drawn. It smelled like wood smoke and something faintly medicinal, sharp and unpleasant. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, a stove in the corner with a stack of firewood beside it. There was a doorway leading to what she assumed was a bedroom, and another smaller door that probably opened onto a storage space or pantry. Everything was clean in the way that suggested function over care. No personal touches, no photographs or quilts or anything that hinted at who lived here. Alara set her small bag down near the door and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to let in more light. Outside, Rowan was leading the horses toward the barn, his movements efficient and practiced. She let the curtain fall and turned back to the room. This was it then. This was her life now. The first few days passed in a kind of numb routine. Rowan left early each morning, often before the sun was fully up, and didn't return until evening. He worked the land, tended the animals, repaired things that needed repairing. She did the same inside the house. Cooked meals he ate in silence, washed clothes in a basin out back, swept floors that never seemed to stay clean for long. They barely looked at each other. When they did sit across from each other at meals, the silence was thick enough to choke on. Alara tried once or twice to say something, just small talk, observations about the weather or the chickens, but Rowan's gaze would slide past her like she wasn't there, and she'd stop mid-sentence, the words dying in her mouth. He couldn't hear her. She knew that, but it felt like more than deafness. It felt like refusal. On the 4th night, she found a slate and chalk on a shelf in the pantry, the kind school children used. She brought it to the table during supper and set it between them. Rowan glanced at it, then at her. She picked up the chalk and wrote, "Can you read?" He stared at the slate for a moment, then reached out and turned it around so it faced him properly. He nodded once. She wrote, "Do you want me to write when I need to tell you something?" He took the chalk from her hand and wrote in blocky, uneven letters, "If you need to." That was all. He set the chalk down and went back to his meal. It wasn't much, but it was the first real exchange they'd had. Alara tucked it away like a small victory. But that night, lying in the narrow bed in the corner of the main room, Rowan had taken the bedroom without discussion. She heard something that made her sit up in the dark. A sound, low and strangled, coming from the other side of the wall. She waited, listening. It came again. A groan, pained and involuntary. She pushed back the blanket and crept to the bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see Rowan sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. His shoulders were rigid, his breathing harsh and uneven. Blood dripped from between his fingers, dark and wet in the moonlight coming through the window. Alara's breath caught. He didn't seem to notice her. He pressed a rag to the side of his head, just below his ear, and held it there with the kind of grim patience that suggested this was familiar. Routine, even. She backed away from the door as quietly as she could and returned to her bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin. For a long time, she lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of his pain filtering through the wall, and wondered what kind of man bled like that in silence. The days continued to pass, measured out in chores and meals and the long stretches of quiet in between. Alara learned the rhythms of the ranch, when to feed the chickens, how much wood to stack by the stove, where Rowan kept the tools and supplies. She learned that he preferred his coffee black and strong, that he didn't like beans cooked too soft, that he had a habit of running his hand along the edge of the table when he was thinking. She also learned that people in town didn't think much of either of them. The first time she went into town alone, Rowan had given her a small amount of money and a list of supplies to pick up. She felt the stares before she even stepped into the general store. Mrs. Halford, the banker's wife, was inside buying fabric. She looked Alara up and down with the kind of expression reserved for something unpleasant you'd scraped off your boot. "Well," Mrs. Halford said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "If it isn't Mrs. Cade," Alara forced a polite nod. "Ma'am, I must say I didn't think anyone would actually go through with it." Mrs. Halford leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to pretend discretion. $50. That's what I heard. $50 for a wife. Can you imagine? Heat flooded Alara's face, but she kept her expression neutral. "I need to pick up some supplies." Mrs. Halford's smile widened. "Of course, dear. Don't let me keep you." As Alara moved toward the counter, she heard the whispers start up behind her, low and buzzing, like wasps in a jar. The store owner, a different man from the one who'd handled the signing, younger and less careful, handed over the items on her list without much comment, but his eyes lingered on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "You settling in all right out there?" he asked. "Fine, thank you. Must be strange living with a man who can't talk back." She met his gaze steadily. "He manages just fine." The man smirked. "I'm sure he does." Alara paid, gathered her things, and left as quickly as she could without running. On the ride back to the ranch, she tried to shake off the humiliation, but it clung to her like dust. $50. That's what everyone would remember. Not her name, not her choices, just the price. When she got back, Rowan was in the barn. She carried the supplies inside and put them away, then stood at the window watching him work. He was repairing a section of fence, his movements methodical and deliberate. She thought about the whispers, the smirks, the way people looked at her like she was something to be pitied or scorned, and then she thought about the blood on Rowan's hands in the middle of the night, the way he'd sat there alone in the dark, enduring. Maybe people were right to pity them, but maybe they didn't know the whole story. That night, she woke to the sound again, the low, choked groan from the other room. This time, she didn't just listen. She got up, crossed the room, and pushed the bedroom door open. Rowan was sitting in the same position as before, head in his hands, blood seeping between his fingers. He looked up when the door creaked, his eyes meeting hers with something like shock, or maybe anger. It was hard to tell. She stepped inside. He shook his head sharply, gesturing for her to leave. She ignored him. Instead, she moved to the small table beside the bed, where he kept a basin and a few clean rags. She poured water from the pitcher, soaked one of the rags, and wrung it out. When she turned back to him, he was still staring at her, his expression unreadable. She held out the rag. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he lowered his hands and let her see. The blood was coming from his ear, dark and thick. The skin around it was inflamed, angry-looking. She could see him clenching his jaw, the muscles in his neck tight with pain. Alara knelt in front of him and gently pressed the damp rag to the side of his head. He flinched but didn't pull away. She worked carefully, wiping away the blood, trying to see what might be causing this. But in the dim light, with only the moonlight filtering through the window, it was impossible to tell. When she pulled the rag back, it was soaked red. Rowan reached up and took it from her, holding it in place himself. His eyes were still on her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something other than coldness in them. Gratitude, maybe, or just exhaustion. She stood and left the room without a word, closing the door quietly behind her. Back in her own bed, she lay awake for a long time, listening to the silence. Something was wrong with him, something more than deafness. And whatever it was, he'd been living with it alone for a long time. The next morning, Rowan didn't mention what had happened. Neither did she. They moved through their routines as usual, the silence between them just as thick as before. But something had shifted. A few days later, Alara made another trip into town. This time, when Mrs. Halford and her friends whispered, Alara didn't look away. She met their eyes with steady defiance until they were the ones who turned aside. At the general store, she bought bandages and a bottle of carbolic acid along with the usual supplies. The store owner raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. When she got home, she set the medical supplies on the kitchen table where Rowan would see them. He came in that evening, dusty and tired, and stopped when he saw them. He looked at the bandages, then at her. She shrugged, as if to say, just in case. He didn't thank her. But that night, when she heard the sounds of pain from the other room, they were quieter, muffled. And when she checked the medical supplies the next morning, the bandages were gone. It was a week before Alara worked up the nerve to ask the question that had been circling in her mind since the night she first saw him bleeding. She waited until supper, when they were both sitting at the table, the remains of the meal between them. She picked up the slate and wrote carefully. "Why do you bleed like that?" Rowan read the question, his jaw tightening. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he took the chalk and wrote, "Don't know. Always has." She stared at the words. "Always?" He nodded. "Have you seen a doctor?" He shook his head and wrote, "No money, no point." Alara set the chalk down and looked at him. Really looked at him. He was thinner than she'd first thought, his face drawn in a way that suggested chronic pain. The kind of thing you learn to live with because you didn't have another choice. She picked up the chalk again. "I think there's something in there." Rowan's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "Something alive," she wrote. He stared at the slate for a long time. Then he took the chalk and wrote one word. Impossible. Alara didn't argue, but she didn't erase the words either. That night she lay awake again, thinking, trying to piece together what little she knew. The pain, the bleeding, the way it seemed to come in waves, sometimes worse than others. If there was something in his ear, something alive, something that had been there for years, what would that even look like? How would you get it out? And more importantly, would he even let her try? The answer came 2 nights later, when Rowan collapsed. Alara was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when she heard the crash from the bedroom. She dropped the plate she was holding, it shattered on the floor, and ran. Rowan was on the ground, convulsing, his hands clutching at his head. Blood poured from his ear, more than she'd ever seen before, pooling on the wooden floor beneath him. She dropped to her knees beside him, her heart hammering. His eyes were open but unfocused, his breathing ragged. "Rowan," she said, even though she knew he couldn't hear her. "Rowan, stay with me." She grabbed one of the clean rags from the bedside table and pressed it to his ear, trying to staunch the bleeding. His body jerked beneath her hands, and she had to use all her weight to keep him still. Slowly, the convulsions began to ease. His breathing evened out, though it was still harsh and labored. When his eyes finally focused on her, they were filled with something she hadn't seen before. Fear. She kept pressure on the wound, her other hand on his shoulder, grounding him. After a few minutes, he stopped shaking entirely. He was pale, his skin clammy with sweat. Alara pulled the rag away carefully and looked at the wound. And that's when she saw it. Something moving. Just beneath the surface of the inflamed skin, something dark and writhing. Her stomach turned, but she didn't look away. She grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and held it close, angling the light so she could see better. There, right at the edge of the ear canal, something thin and segmented, barely visible, contracting and expanding like it was breathing. Alara's hand started to shake, but she forced herself to stay calm. She looked at Rowan. His eyes were on her, wide and unblinking. She reached for the slate, her movements jerky, and wrote, "I can see it. I think I can get it out." Rowan read the words, and for a moment she thought he would refuse, push her away, tell her to leave him alone. But he didn't. Instead, he closed his eyes and nodded. Alara's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had no idea what she was doing, no training, no experience, just instinct and desperation. She set the lamp down carefully, positioning it so the light fell directly on Rowan's ear. Then she grabbed the smallest pair of tweezers she could find, meant for splinters, not for this, and took a deep breath. "Don't move," she whispered, even though he couldn't hear her. She leaned in close, steadying her hand, and carefully inserted the tweezers into the ear canal. Rowan's entire body went rigid, but he didn't pull away. She could feel the resistance immediately. Whatever was in there, it was alive. It moved against the tweezers, trying to pull back deeper into the canal. Alara's hands were slick with sweat, but she adjusted her grip and tried again, working the tweezers deeper. And then she felt it, the give, the moment when the tweezers closed around something solid. She pulled. Rowan made a sound, low and strangled, somewhere between a gasp and a scream. And then, suddenly, it came free. Alara jerked back, holding the tweezers up to the light. Dangling from the ends was a creature. Thin, pale, segmented like a worm, but longer, easily 3 inches. It writhed in the air, twisting and coiling around itself. She dropped it onto the floor and stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Rowan sat up slowly, one hand pressed to his ear. Blood still seeped from the wound, but less now. He looked at the creature on the floor, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. And then Rowan did something Alara had never seen him do. He smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. She let out a shaky laugh, half relief, half hysteria, and sank down onto the floor beside him. Whatever happened next, whatever this strange, impossible marriage had become, one thing was clear. She had just saved his life. The creature lay on the floor between them, no longer writhing. In the lamplight, it looked almost fragile, translucent skin revealing darker segments beneath, each one pulsing faintly before going still. Alara couldn't stop staring at it, her mind struggling to make sense of what she'd just pulled from Rowan's body. He was still sitting on the floor, one hand pressed to his ear, his breathing slowly evening out. The blood had slowed to a trickle, dark against his neck and collar. His eyes kept moving from the creature to her face and back again, like he was trying to reconcile what had just happened with everything he'd believed about his own suffering. Alara's hands were still shaking. She wiped them on her skirt, already ruined with blood, and forced herself to take a proper breath. "We need to clean that," she said, then caught herself. The words were useless. He couldn't hear them. She pushed herself to her feet and grabbed the basin, pouring fresh water and gathering clean rags. When she knelt beside him again, Rowan lowered his hand slowly, letting her see the damage. The ear canal was raw, inflamed, seeping blood and something else. Clear fluid that might have been infection or just the body's response to trauma. She worked carefully, dabbing away the blood, trying not to cause more pain than necessary. Rowan's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the wall across from them, but he didn't pull away. When she reached for the carbolic acid, he flinched at the smell, then steeled himself. The first touch of it made him go rigid, his hand closing into a fist against his thigh. Alara bit her lip and kept working, cleaning the wound as thoroughly as she dared. By the time she finished and wrapped a clean bandage around his head to hold a pad in place, they were both exhausted. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. Really looked at him. The lines of pain around his eyes seemed deeper than before, but there was something else there too. Relief, maybe. Or just the absence of the constant agony he'd been living with. Rowan reached out slowly and picked up the dead creature from the floor, holding it up to the light. His expression was unreadable. Then he stood, walked to the stove, and threw it into the fire. They watched it burn together, neither of them moving until it was nothing but ash. That night, Alara didn't go back to her bed in the main room. She pulled the chair from beside Rowan's bed closer to where he lay and sat down, keeping watch. If there was infection, if the bleeding started again, if anything went wrong, she wanted to be there. Rowan had protested weakly, gesturing toward the door, but she'd shaken her head and stayed put. Eventually, he'd given up and closed his eyes. She must have dozed off at some point because when she woke, pale morning light was filtering through the window, and Rowan was sitting up in bed watching her. The bandage was still in place, no fresh blood seeping through. He looked tired but more present than she'd seen him in days. When their eyes met, he reached for the slate on the bedside table and wrote, "Thank you." Alara felt something catch in her chest. 2 simple words, but they carried weight. She nodded, not trusting her voice even though he couldn't hear it anyway. He wrote again, "How did you know?" She took the chalk from him. "I didn't, I guessed." "Dangerous guess." She almost smiled. "You were dying anyway." He stared at that for a moment, then nodded slowly. It was true. Whatever that thing had been, it had been killing him by inches for years, maybe decades. Rowan set the slate aside and swung his legs out of bed, moving carefully like he expected pain that didn't come. When he stood, he swayed slightly, and Alara was on her feet immediately, one hand on his arm to steady him. He looked down at her hand, then at her face. For a moment, she thought he might pull away, reassert the distance that had defined every interaction they'd had since she arrived. But he didn't. He just stood there, letting her help him find his balance. When he was steady, she let go and stepped back. They moved through the morning in a kind of careful quiet. Alara made breakfast while Rowan sat at the table, his movements slower than usual, but deliberate. She could see him testing himself, turning his head, touching the bandage lightly, trying to gauge what had changed. After they ate, he picked up the slate and wrote, "Need to check the fences. North pasture." Alara frowned. "You should rest." "Can't afford to rest." She wanted to argue, but she understood. The ranch didn't stop because he'd nearly died. The animals still needed tending, the work still needed doing. That was the reality of this life. "I'll come with you," she wrote. He looked surprised, then skeptical. "It's rough ground. I can manage." He studied her for a moment, then shrugged and stood. If she wanted to come, that was her choice. The north pasture was a good 2 miles from the house, accessible only by a narrow trail that cut through scrub brush and rocky terrain. Rowan rode his horse, a big roan gelding that seemed unbothered by the uneven ground. Alara followed on a smaller mare that had been standing in the corral, saddled but patient. They didn't speak, couldn't speak, but Alara found herself watching the way Rowan moved, the way he sat his horse with an ease that spoke of years in the saddle. Out here, away from the house and the weight of their strange arrangement, he seemed more himself, less guarded. When they reached the fence line, Rowan dismounted and began walking the perimeter, checking posts and wire for damage. Alara climbed down and followed at a distance, not sure what she was supposed to be doing, but unwilling to just stand around. She found the first break about 50 yards down. Wire snapped clean, probably from an animal pushing through or a fallen branch. She called out without thinking, then remembered and waved her arm instead. Rowan looked up, saw her pointing, and came over. He examined the break, then nodded and went back to his horse for tools. They worked together in silence, Rowan splicing the wire while Alara held the tension, learning as she went. Her hands weren't used to this kind of work, and by the time they finished, her palms were red and sore, a blister forming on one thumb. When Rowan noticed, he frowned and reached for her hand, turning it over to see the damage. His fingers were rough but surprisingly gentle. He looked at her like he was trying to decide if he should be annoyed or impressed. Finally, he just shook his head and let go. They rode back in the early afternoon, the sun high and brutal. Alara's entire body ached from the ride and the unfamiliar work, but she didn't regret coming. There was something clarifying about it, the simplicity of a problem you could fix with your hands, the satisfaction of work that showed immediate results. When they got back to the house, Rowan tended to the horses while Alara went inside to start supper. Her hands were clumsy with the blister, but she managed. By the time Rowan came in, she had stew on the stove and bread warming. They ate without the slate, the silence between them different now, less hostile, more like two people who were too tired to pretend at conversation. After supper, Alara changed the bandage on Rowan's ear. The wound looked better, still raw, but no signs of infection. He sat still while she worked, his eyes closed, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt like maybe this strange arrangement might become something bearable. That fragile peace lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th morning after the extraction, Alara went into town alone. They needed supplies, flour, salt, a few other staples, and Rowan was busy with a sick calf in the barn. She took the wagon and made the trip, expecting the usual stares and whispers, but nothing worse. She should have known better. The general store was crowded when she arrived, more people than usual for a weekday morning. Alara recognized most of them, townspeople she'd seen in passing, a few ranchers from neighboring properties, Mrs. Halford holding court near the fabric display. The conversations didn't stop when she walked in, but they changed. Voices dropped, eyes cut toward her and then away. Alara kept her head up and moved toward the counter where the store owner was measuring out nails for another customer. She waited her turn, trying to ignore the weight of attention on her back. "Well, well," a voice said from behind her. Male, rough with drink even though it was barely noon. "If it isn't the charity case." Alara's shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. $50, the voice continued, louder now. "That's what I heard. $50 for damaged goods. Hell, I might have paid that myself if I'd known the auction was open." Laughter rippled through the store, ugly and sharp. Alara turned slowly. The man speaking was someone she didn't recognize, tall, heavy-set, with a red face and small, mean eyes. He was grinning at her like he'd just said something clever. "You got something you want to say to me?" she asked quietly. The man's grin widened. Just making conversation. Though I gotta wonder what a man like Cade needs with a wife anyway. It's not like he can hear her complain. More laughter. Mrs. Halford was watching with barely concealed delight, her hand pressed to her chest like she was scandalized, but her eyes bright with satisfaction. Or maybe that's the point. Another voice chimed in, younger, sharper. Get himself a woman who'll keep house and shut up about it. Smart, really. Elara's hands curled into fists at her sides. She wanted to say something cutting, something that would shut them all down, but the words stuck in her throat. Because underneath the cruelty was a truth she couldn't deny. She had been bought. Her father had sold her to clear a debt, and Rowan had paid, and now everyone in this miserable town knew it. Leave her alone, Carter, the store owner said, his voice bored. You're scaring off customers. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, Carter replied. Though I heard something else interesting. Heard Cade's been having some health trouble lately. Bad enough he needed help. That true, Mrs. Cade? Elara's stomach dropped. How did they know? She'd been so careful, hadn't told anyone. Saw the bandages in your last order, the store owner said, answering her unspoken question. Carbolic acid, too. Figured something was wrong. Of course, nothing stayed private in a town this size. Maybe she's trying to poison him, someone suggested, and the laughter started up again. Elara turned back to the counter, her face burning. I need flour, salt, and coffee, she said, her voice flat. I can pay. The store owner nodded and began gathering the items. The conversations around her had shifted now, people talking openly about her and Rowan like they weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. Heard he hasn't said a word to her since the wedding. Well, he can't, can he? Maybe that's why she married him, wanted a man who couldn't talk back. Or maybe she just wanted out of that shack her family's been rotting in. Elara paid, gathered her supplies, and walked out without looking at anyone. The laughter followed her into the street. She was halfway to the wagon when Carter appeared beside her, moving faster than a man his size should be able to. Hey now, don't run off. I wasn't trying to be rude. Yes, you were, Elara said, not slowing down. He caught her arm, not hard, but firm enough to stop her. Just wanted to give you some advice, woman to woman, so to speak. She yanked her arm free. I'm not interested. You should be. Carter leaned in closer, his breath sour. See, there's something you should know about that husband of yours. That marriage? It wasn't his idea. Elara's blood went cold. What are you talking about? And Carter's grin turned nasty. It was a bet. Me and some of the boys, we were drinking one night about 6 months back, and someone said Cade would die alone out there on that ranch. Said no woman would ever take him. I said any woman could be bought for the right price. He paused, enjoying himself. Your father owed money to half the town. Wasn't hard to arrange. The world tilted sideways. Elara felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. You're lying. Am I? Ask him. Ask your husband if he came up with the idea himself, or if someone else suggested it. Ask him how much of that $50 was his money, and how much came from the pot we all threw in. Carter stepped back, hands raised in mock innocence. Just thought you should know what you're really worth. He walked away laughing, leaving Elara standing in the middle of the street with her arms full of supplies and her entire understanding of the last few weeks crumbling around her. She made it back to the ranch on autopilot, her mind churning. A bet. The whole thing had been a bet. Her marriage, her life, everything. It was all just entertainment for drunk men with nothing better to do. When she pulled the wagon up to the house, Rowan was outside, mending a harness. He looked up when he heard the horses, his expression brightening slightly when he saw her. That made it worse. Elara climbed down and started unloading supplies with sharp, angry movements. Rowan set down the harness and came over to help, reaching for one of the sacks. She pulled it away from him. He frowned, confused. She grabbed the slate from the porch. She'd started keeping it outside for quick exchanges, and wrote in harsh, jagged letters, Was our marriage a bet? Rowan went very still. The color drained from his face. That was answer enough. Elara's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the chalk. You let them buy me like a horse. You let them make me into a joke. Rowan reached for the slate, but she pulled it back, not ready to hear whatever excuse he was about to write. How much of the $50 was yours? She wrote. How much came from them? He didn't take the slate this time. He just stood there, looking at her with something that might have been shame or might have been resignation. She threw the slate at his feet. It cracked against the ground but didn't break. Then she turned and walked into the house, slamming the door behind her. She spent the rest of the day in a furious haze, scrubbing floors that didn't need scrubbing, reorganizing shelves that were already organized, doing anything to keep her hands busy so she didn't have to think about what Carter had told her. But the thoughts came anyway, relentless and brutal. Rowan had known. He'd known the whole time that their marriage was a joke, that she'd been bought with pooled money from men who wanted to see if it could be done. And he'd said nothing, done nothing. Just let her walk into this life thinking it was at least honest desperation, not malicious entertainment. When evening came, she heard Rowan come inside. His footsteps were hesitant, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to enter his own house anymore. Alara was at the stove, her back to him. She didn't turn around. She heard him set something down on the table. The slate, probably. A moment later, she heard the soft scratch of chalk on stone. Still, she didn't turn. Finally, she heard him leave again, the door closing quietly behind him. Only then did she look at the table. The slate sat there with a message written in Rowan's blocky handwriting. "I'm sorry. You deserved better than this." Alara stared at it for a long time. Then she picked it up and threw it into the fire. That night she lay in her bed in the main room and listened to the silence from Rowan's bedroom. No sounds of pain, no groaning or bleeding. Whatever healing had started after she'd removed the creature, it was continuing. She'd saved his life, and he'd let her believe their marriage meant something other than humiliation. The anger sat in her chest like a hot coal, burning everything it touched. But underneath the anger was something else. Something she didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. She'd seen the look on Rowan's face when she'd confronted him. The shame, the resignation, like he'd known this moment would come eventually and had been dreading it. He hadn't defended himself, hadn't tried to explain or justify. He'd just accepted her anger like he believed he deserved it. Maybe he did, but that didn't change the fact that over the past few weeks, something had shifted between them. Something that felt, against all odds, like it might have been the beginning of trust. And now it was gone. Alara turned over and pulled the blanket up to her chin, trying to shut out the thoughts that wouldn't stop circling. Tomorrow, she decided, she would figure out what to do. Whether to stay or leave. Whether to forgive or hold on to her anger. But tonight, she just needed to survive the weight of knowing that everything she'd been building was constructed on a foundation of cruelty and shame. And the worst part was, she didn't know if that foundation could ever be solid enough to hold anything real. Morning came too early. Alara woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sounds of Rowan already up and moving around outside. She lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling before forcing herself out of bed. The anger from yesterday was still there, but duller now. More like a bruise than a fresh wound. She went through the motions of starting breakfast, her movements mechanical. When Rowan came inside, she didn't look at him, just set his plate down and sat across from him in silence. They ate without speaking, without even the slate between them. The distance felt enormous. After breakfast, Rowan stood and went to the door. He paused there, one hand on the frame, then turned back. He crossed to the shelf where they kept supplies and pulled down a wooden box Alara hadn't noticed before. He brought it to the table and opened it. Inside was money, more than Alara had ever seen in one place. Bills and coins, neatly organized. Rowan pulled out $50 exactly and set it on the table in front of her. Then he wrote on a scrap of paper, "Yours. Leave if you want. I won't stop you." Alara stared at the money. $50. The exact amount she'd been sold for. He was giving it back, giving her the choice he'd taken away when he'd agreed to that bet. She looked up at him. His face was carefully blank, but his eyes told a different story. He expected her to take it, expected her to walk out and never look back. Maybe she should. But as she sat there, looking at the money and then at the man who'd put it there, Alara realized something. She didn't want to leave. Not because she forgave him, not because the anger had disappeared, but because despite everything, the humiliation, the betrayal, the cruelty, something had happened between them that mattered. She'd seen him at his most vulnerable. She'd pulled a creature from his body that had been torturing him for years. She'd sat with him in the dark and bandaged his wounds, and ridden out to fix fences in the brutal sun. That meant something, even if it had started as a joke. Elara pushed the money back across the table toward him. Rowan's eyes widened. She grabbed the scrap of paper he'd written on and turned it over, writing on the back, "I'm not leaving, but things are going to be different." He stared at the words, then at her. "No more secrets," she wrote. "No more pretending. If I'm staying, it's because I choose to, not because I'm trapped." Rowan picked up the pencil slowly and wrote, "What do you want?" Elara thought about that. What did she want? Respect, certainly. Honesty, a partnership instead of a transaction. "I want the truth," she wrote, "about everything. The bet. Why you agreed to it. What you expected from this marriage." Rowan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He took the pencil and began to write. His handwriting was messier than usual, the words coming in fits and starts like he was having to drag them out of himself. The bet was Carter's idea. 6 months ago, like he said. "I didn't think anyone would actually do it, but your father came to me, said he needed money, asked if I was serious about wanting a wife. I said yes because I was tired of being alone, tired of the silence. Thought maybe someone else in the house would make it easier. I didn't know they'd tell you it was a bet. Thought they'd keep it quiet. When you showed up, I realized how bad it was. But by then it was done." Elara read the words twice, her chest tight. It wasn't an excuse. It was barely even an explanation. But it was honest. "Did you think I'd just accept it?" she wrote. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" "I hoped you wouldn't," he wrote back. "I hoped maybe we could make something real out of it anyway." She almost laughed. Make something real out of a bet and a transaction. It was absurd, but wasn't that exactly what had started to happen before she found out the truth? "I pulled a creature out of your head," she wrote. "I've seen you bleed and hurt and nearly die, and you never told me any of this." "I know," he wrote. "I'm sorry." Elara set the pencil down and stood up, pacing to the window. Outside, the land stretched out forever, empty and hard and unforgiving. This place didn't care about fairness or hurt feelings. It just existed, demanding that you adapt or fail. She'd adapted to worse things than this. She turned back to Rowan. "I'm staying," she said out loud, even though he couldn't hear her. Then she picked up the pencil and wrote it down so he could. "I'm staying, but you owe me. You owe me honesty and respect and a real partnership, not whatever this has been." Rowan read it, then nodded slowly. He picked up the pencil one more time. "I'll try," he wrote. "That's all I can promise." It wasn't much, but Elara was beginning to understand that in a life like this, nothing ever was. She nodded and turned back to the dishes, ending the conversation before it could spiral into something neither of them was ready for. Behind her, she heard Rowan gather up the money and put it back in the box. The lid closed with a soft click. Then he left, the door closing quietly behind him. Elara stood at the sink, her hands in the cold water, and let herself feel the full weight of everything that had just happened. She'd been bought, humiliated, lied to. But she'd also made a choice to stay, to try to build something real out of the wreckage of that bet. It was a gamble, maybe a stupid one, but then again, so was pulling a creature out of a man's ear with nothing but tweezers and hope. And she'd already won that bet. Maybe winning that bet was what gave her the nerve for what came next. The days after their confrontation moved differently. Not easier exactly, but clearer. Rowan worked the ranch with the same relentless focus he always had. But now when he came in for meals, he'd leave the slate on the table between them. Small communications, questions about supplies they needed, warnings about weather coming in. Once, inexplicably, a comment about one of the chickens being a poor layer. Elara wrote back, not always with words that mattered, but enough to keep the connection alive. She was learning that silence between them didn't have to mean hostility. Sometimes it was just silence. But the anger hadn't disappeared entirely. It sat under everything like bedrock, hard and unyielding. Every time she went into town and felt the stares, every time she remembered Carter's smug face telling her she'd been purchased for entertainment, the anger flared hot and fresh. 2 weeks after their confrontation, she was hanging laundry when she saw riders coming up the road. 3 of them, moving at an easy pace like they had all the time in the world. She recognized Carter immediately, hard to miss a man that size, and her stomach clenched. Rowan was in the barn. She could call for him, but he wouldn't hear. She could run to get him, but that felt like retreat, like fear. Instead, she straightened her back and kept pinning clothes to the line. The riders pulled up near the house. Carter dismounted with a grunt, his boots hitting the ground hard. The other two stayed on their horses, younger men, ranch hands by the look of them, here for the show. "Mrs. Cade," Carter said, tipping his hat in mock politeness. "Lovely day." Alara didn't answer. She picked up another wet shirt and shook it out. "Where's your husband? Got some business to discuss with him." "He's occupied," Alara said flatly. Carter grinned. "That's all right. Maybe you can help. See, there's been some talk in town. People saying Cade's been doing better lately. Not stumbling around like he used to. Some folks are wondering if maybe he was faking all along, playing up the poor deaf cripple routine for sympathy." Alara's hand stilled on the laundry. "He wasn't faking anything." "You sure about that? Because, funny thing, soon as he gets himself a wife, suddenly he's healthy as a horse. Makes a man wonder what changed." "Maybe having someone actually care whether he lived or died made a difference," Alara shot back. One of the younger men laughed. Carter's expression hardened. "Careful now. That's a sharp tongue for a woman in your position." "And what position is that?" "Bought and paid for." Carter took a step closer. "See, the way I figure it, that $50 means you belong to him. And what belongs to him belongs to this town, in a manner of speaking. We invested in this little arrangement. We got a right to see how it's working out." Alara dropped the shirt back into the basket and turned to face him fully. "You got nothing. You made a bet, and you lost. Rowan's not dying alone, and I'm not leaving. So whatever you came here for, you can turn around and go back to town. See? That's where you're wrong." Carter's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The bet's not over. The bet was whether any woman could be bought for the right price, and you staying, that proves me right. You were bought. You're still here because you got nowhere else to go." "I'm here because I choose to be." "Sure you are. Just like you chose to marry a man you'd never met. Just like you chose to come out to this miserable piece of land and play house with a cripple." He gestured around at the ranch. "This is what $50 buys. Not much, is it?" Alara's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, movement caught her eye. Rowan had emerged from the barn, and he was walking toward them with purpose in his stride. He must have seen the horses, put together what was happening. Carter saw him too, and grinned wider. "There he is, the man of the house. We were just discussing your wife's gratitude." Rowan's eyes went to Alara first, checking if she was all right. She gave a small nod. Then his gaze shifted to Carter, and something cold settled into his expression. Carter pulled out the slate he'd apparently brought with him, prepared for this confrontation, and wrote something, then held it up so Rowan could see. "How's the wife working out? Worth the investment?" Rowan didn't even glance at the slate. He walked past Carter to Alara, positioned himself slightly between her and the men, and just stood there, waiting. The message was clear. Leave. Carter's smile faltered. "Now that's just rude. I came all this way to check on our investment, and you can't even be bothered to respond?" Rowan still didn't move. "Fine, be that way." Carter tucked the slate back under his arm. "But you should know, people in town are talking, saying maybe this whole thing was a fraud, saying maybe you were never as bad off as you claimed. And if that's true, well, that makes you a liar and a cheat, which means anything we did to you was justified." Rowan's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't move, didn't respond, just kept that cold, level stare fixed on Carter until the bigger man shifted uncomfortably. "Come on, boys," Carter finally said to his companions. "Nothing to see here. Just a man and his purchase." They mounted up and rode off, kicking up dust. Alara and Rowan stood together in silence until they were out of sight. Only then did Rowan turn to her. He looked furious and helpless at the same time, like he wanted to chase them down but knew it would accomplish nothing. Alara reached past him for the laundry basket. "They're trying to get under your skin. Don't let them." He grabbed the slate from the porch and wrote quickly. "What did he say to you?" "Nothing I couldn't handle." "Alara." She sighed and took the chalk from him. "He said you were faking, said you got better too fast, said it proves the whole thing was a con." Rowan's expression darkened. He wrote, "People believe that?" "Some might." "Does it matter?" "Yes." Alara studied him. The bandage was gone now, the wound on his ear healing to a rough scar. He looked healthier than when she'd first arrived, less gaunt, less haunted by constant pain. To someone who didn't know what she'd pulled out of his head, it might look suspicious. "Then we proved them wrong," she wrote. How? That was the question, wasn't it? How did you prove to people who wanted to believe the worst that they were wrong? How did you fight a narrative that had already taken root? "I don't know yet," she wrote honestly. "But we will." Rowan looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. He picked up the laundry basket and carried it inside, leaving her standing in the yard with the taste of anger still sharp in her mouth. That night, Alara lay awake thinking about Carter's words, about the way people in town looked at her, about the impossible task of building something real when everyone around you was determined to see it as fake. She must have drifted off eventually because she woke to the sound of something crashing in Rowan's room. Alara was on her feet immediately, crossing to his door. She pushed it open without knocking. Rowan was sitting on the floor beside the bed, the lamp overturned next to him, oil spreading across the floorboards. He had one hand pressed to his ear, the healed one, and his face was twisted in pain. "No," Alara breathed. "No, no, no." She dropped to her knees beside him and tried to pull his hand away so she could see. He resisted at first, then let her. Blood. Fresh and dark, seeping from the ear canal. Alara's heart hammered. Had they missed something? Had there been more than one creature? Was the wound infected after all? She ran for the medical supplies, her hands shaking as she gathered clean rags and the carbolic acid. When she came back, Rowan hadn't moved. He was just sitting there, staring at nothing. She knelt in front of him again and gently cleaned the blood away, trying to see the source. The skin was inflamed but not ruptured. The bleeding seemed to be coming from deeper inside. "What happened?" she asked, even though he couldn't hear. "What's wrong?" Rowan's eyes focused on her. He reached for the slate she'd brought without thinking and wrote with shaking hands. "Heard something." Alara's blood went cold. "What do you mean?" "Sound." For just a second. Then pain. She stared at the words, trying to process. He'd heard something. Rowan, who had been deaf for decades, had heard something. "What kind of sound?" she wrote. "Your voice, I think." Just for a second. Then it was gone. Alara's hands started shaking harder. The creature. Whatever it had been in his ear canal for years, maybe decades, and when she'd removed it, she'd removed whatever had been blocking his hearing. But the body didn't heal that fast. The ear canal had been damaged, inflamed, probably scarred. The fact that he'd heard anything at all was impossible. It should have been impossible. She pressed the clean rag to his ear, applying gentle pressure. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. When she pulled the rag away, the wound looked the same as before. No new damage, just irritation. "The ear is healing," she wrote carefully. "Maybe too fast, maybe that's why it hurts." Rowan read it, then looked at her with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. "Could I get my hearing back?" "I don't know." "Maybe. Partially." He closed his eyes and leaned back against the bed. Alara could see him trying to process this, trying to reconcile decades of silence with the possibility of sound. She finished cleaning the wound and applied a fresh bandage, then helped him up onto the bed. He lay back, one arm over his eyes, and didn't move. Alara sat on the edge of the bed, watching him. After a long moment, she reached out and touched his shoulder. He didn't pull away. They stayed like that until the oil lamp burned low, and she had to leave to refill it. When she came back, Rowan was asleep, his breathing deep and even, despite the pain he'd been in just minutes before. Alara sat in the chair beside the bed and kept watch, just like she had that first night after removing the creature. And as she sat there in the dark, she thought about what it would mean if Rowan's hearing came back, how it would change things between them, how it would change everything. The next morning, Rowan woke with the bandage soaked through again, but the bleeding had stopped. Alara changed it without comment, and they went about their day as usual. But there was a tension now, an awareness that something was shifting beneath the surface. 3 days later, it happened again. Rowan was outside working on the corral fence when he suddenly stopped, one hand flying to his ear. Alara saw it from the window and ran outside. By the time she reached him, he was on his knees in the dirt, blood running down the side of his neck. But his eyes were wide, almost frantic, and when he saw her, he grabbed for the slate he'd started carrying everywhere. "I heard the horses," he wrote, his handwriting barely legible. The sound of their hooves, clear as anything. Then it stopped. Alara's chest tightened. It was happening. His hearing was coming back in fragments, brief bursts of sound that his damaged ear couldn't sustain. Each time it happened, the strain caused bleeding. She helped him inside and cleaned the wound again, her mind racing. This couldn't continue. If his ear kept hemorrhaging like this, it could cause permanent damage. Or worse. "You need to see a doctor," she wrote. Rowan shook his head violently. "No money, and no doctor will know what to do." "Then what? We just wait for your ear to kill you? It's not going to kill me. You don't know that." They glared at each other across the table, the slate between them covered in increasingly frustrated scrawls. Finally, Rowan grabbed the chalk and wrote, "Just let it heal. However long it takes. And if it doesn't heal, if it gets worse, then we deal with it." Alara wanted to scream. His stubbornness was going to get him killed, and he didn't even seem to care. But she also understood. He'd lived with pain and silence for so long that the possibility of hearing again was worth any risk. She just hoped the risk didn't cost him everything. Over the next 2 weeks, the episodes continued. Sometimes they came days apart, sometimes within hours of each other. Each time Rowan would hear something, wind in the trees, the creak of the house settling, once even Alara's footsteps crossing the floor, and then pain would slam through his head and the bleeding would start. But slowly, gradually, the intervals between episodes grew longer. The bleeding became less severe, and the sounds Rowan could hear began to last a fraction longer before fading. His ear was adapting, healing around the damage, learning to process sound again after years of silence. It was the most painful, terrifying miracle Alara had ever witnessed. During this time, they stayed away from town. Alara couldn't face the stares and whispers, and Rowan was in no condition to be seen. They existed in a kind of isolation, just the two of them, and the ranch and the slow, agonizing process of healing. But isolation couldn't last forever. One morning, Alara woke to find they were completely out of flour and nearly out of everything else. She'd been stretching their supplies, making do, but there was no putting it off any longer. Someone had to go to town. Rowan was in the barn, his hearing stable for the past 3 days, the longest stretch yet. Alara found him mucking out stalls and waved to get his attention. When he looked up, she held up the slate. "We need supplies. I'm going to town." He frowned and shook his head, taking the slate from her. "I'll go. You're not ready. Neither are you. They'll tear you apart." Alara almost smiled. "They've been trying to do that since I got here. I'm still standing." Rowan looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Then he wrote, "I'm coming with you. Your ear is fine, and you're not going alone." There was no arguing with him when he got like this. Alara nodded and went inside to get ready. An hour later, they were on the road to town, sitting side by side on the wagon bench. It was the first time they'd gone anywhere together since the day he'd brought her home as his wife. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. The town appeared on the horizon, small and mean-looking under the midday sun. As they rolled down the main street, heads turned. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Rowan pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and set the brake. He climbed down first, then offered Alara his hand. She took it, feeling the weight of every eye on them. The store was crowded. Of course it was. Alara had a feeling word had spread that they were coming. The conversations died the moment they walked through the door. Mrs. Halford was there, along with several other women from town. Carter was there too, leaning against the counter like he owned the place. "Well, well," Mud, he said. "Look who decided to show their faces." Rowan ignored him and walked to the counter where the store owner stood. He pulled out the supply list and set it down. The store owner glanced at it, then at Rowan. "That's a lot of supplies. You got money for all this?" Rowan pulled out his money and counted it onto the counter. Exact change. He'd planned for this. The store owner shrugged and started gathering items. While he worked, Carter pushed off from the wall and sauntered over. "Heard you had some health problems, Cade. Heard you were bleeding from the head. That true?" Rowan didn't respond, didn't even look at him. "People are saying maybe you had something wrong with you all along, something nobody knew about. Maybe something you were hiding." Carter's voice carried through the store. "Makes a man wonder if the deafness was real, or if that was fake too." Alara stepped forward, her voice sharp. "He's not faking anything." "You sure about that, Mrs. Cade? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he's been playing everyone for fools." getting sympathy he didn't deserve, taking charity that should have gone to people who actually needed it. He nearly died, Alara said, her voice rising. There was something in his ear, a creature. I pulled it out myself. The store went dead silent. Then Carter started laughing. A creature, right, and I suppose it was eating his brain. It was torturing him for years, maybe decades. And none of you ever cared enough to find out why he was suffering. Because he's a liar, Carter said flatly. Always has been. Playing up his disability to avoid work, avoid responsibility, and you're just covering for him because you're stuck out there and got nowhere else to go. Rowan's hand shot out and grabbed Carter by the front of his shirt, yanking him forward with surprising strength. For a moment it looked like he might actually throw a punch. But then he stopped, released Carter, stepped back. Carter straightened his shirt, his face red with anger and embarrassment. You want to start something, Cade? Go ahead. Give me a reason. Rowan pulled out the slate and wrote quickly, Leave my wife alone. Carter read it and laughed again. Your wife, that's rich. She's not your wife, she's your property, bought and paid for, and property doesn't get to make demands. Something inside Alara snapped. She stepped between them, her eyes blazing. I'm not property, and if you ever come near our ranch again, if you ever speak to me or about me like that again, I will make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of man you are. The kind who gets drunk and makes bets on people's lives, the kind who thinks $50 gives him ownership over another human being, the kind who's so pathetic he has to humiliate others to feel powerful. Carter's smile disappeared. You threatening me? I'm promising you, Alara said. Touch me, talk about me, even look at me wrong, and I'll burn your reputation to the ground. For a moment, nobody moved. The entire store was frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Then Rowan put his hand on Alara's shoulder, not pulling her back, just there, standing with her. The store owner cleared his throat. Your supplies are ready. Rowan gathered the bags. Alara took what she could carry, and they walked out together. Behind them, the silence erupted into furious whispers, but Alara didn't look back. They loaded the wagon and climbed up. Rowan snapped the reins and they started moving. They were halfway out of town when Alara heard it, a sound she'd never heard before, low and rough, like gravel scraping against itself. Rowan's voice. He was laughing. She turned to stare at him. His hand was pressed to his bandaged ear, blood seeping through again, but he was laughing. Actually laughing. And even though she couldn't hear it clearly, even though it was broken and painful and probably doing more damage to his healing ear, it was the most beautiful sound Alara had ever heard. By the time they got back to the ranch, the laughter had stopped and Rowan's face was pale. Blood had soaked through the bandage completely, running down his neck and staining his collar. Alara helped him down from the wagon, her heart racing, but when she tried to steer him toward the house, he shook his head and pointed at the supplies. She wanted to argue, but she understood. The horses needed tending first. The supplies needed unloading. That was the rule out here. You took care of what kept you alive before you took care of yourself. So they worked together in tense silence, Rowan moving slower than usual but refusing to stop. When the last bag was inside and the horses were settled, he finally let her lead him to the kitchen. The bandage came off in pieces, stuck to his skin with dried blood. Alara worked as gently as she could, but she saw him wince with every pull. When she finally got it clear, the wound underneath looked angry and raw, worse than it had been in days. She cleaned it with carbolic acid, ignoring the way his hands clenched on the edge of the table. Then she applied fresh bandages and stepped back. Rowan reached for the slate with shaking hands and wrote, "Worth it." Alara almost smiled despite everything. "You're an idiot," she said aloud, then wrote it down so he could see. He shrugged and wrote back, "You threatened Carter. That makes you one too. Fair point." They sat at the table for a long time, the slate between them, neither writing anything. Outside, the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. It was the kind of evening that might have been peaceful if they weren't both still shaking with adrenaline from the confrontation in town. Finally, Rowan picked up the chalk and wrote, "Thank you for standing up for me." Alara took the chalk from him. "Thank you for standing with me." Something shifted in his expression. He looked at her like he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not as the woman who'd been sold to him or the person who'd pulled a creature from his head, but as someone who mattered, someone who'd chosen to stay when she could have left. He reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused from years of hard work, but his grip was gentle, tentative, like he wasn't sure she'd let him. Alara didn't pull away. They sat like that until the light faded and she had to get up to light the lamps. But even after she let go, she could still feel the warmth of his hand on hers. The days after the confrontation in town settled into a new kind of rhythm. Rowan's hearing continued to come back in fragments, sometimes lasting seconds, sometimes barely a whisper of sound before fading again. Each episode still brought blood, but less of it. His body was learning to manage the change, adapting to sensations it hadn't experienced in decades. And as his hearing improved, something else changed. The silence between them began to fill with small attempts at communication that went beyond the slate. Rowan started trying to speak, his voice rough and unpracticed, the words often unclear. Alara would respond out loud even when she wasn't sure he could hear, on the chance that he might catch something. It was clumsy and frustrating and frequently unsuccessful, but it was progress. One evening, about a week after the incident in town, Alara was making supper when she heard it. Alara. Her name. Spoken in that rough, gravelly voice she'd only heard once before. She spun around. Rowan was standing in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, his eyes locked on her face. He looked stunned by his own voice. "Say it again," she said. Alara. Clearer this time, though still rough around the edges. She crossed the room without thinking and stood in front of him. "You can hear me?" He nodded slowly. "Some. Not all. Like you are far away." His voice broke on the last word, and fresh blood appeared at the edge of his bandage. He pressed his hand to it automatically, but his eyes never left her face. "How much can you hear?" she asked. "Enough," he said, then quieter. "Enough to know you have a beautiful voice." Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks. She wasn't used to compliments, especially not from him. "You need to sit down before you fall down." He didn't move. "I heard you, in town, everything you said to Carter." "Most of that was anger talking." "No." His jaw tightened. "It wasn't. You meant it, every word." She'd meant every word, and now standing here with him looking at her like that, she realized how much things had shifted without her noticing. This wasn't about obligation anymore. It wasn't about a transaction or a bet or $50 changing hands. It was something else entirely. "We should change your bandage," she said, deflecting. Rowan caught her wrist gently as she moved past him. "Alara." She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. "You already thanked me." "Not properly." He released her wrist but didn't step back. "You saved my life. You stayed when you didn't have to. You stood up to the whole town for me. I don't know how to repay that." You don't have to repay it." "Yes, I do." His voice was steady despite the blood now trickling down his neck. "You deserve better than what you got. Better than me. Better than this place. Better than being bought like livestock." "Stop," Alara said firmly. "I'm tired of hearing about what I deserve. I'm here because I chose to be. That choice matters more than how we started." "Does it?" "Yes." She met his eyes. "It does to me. Does it to you?" For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then he nodded. "Yes." The word hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to face. Alara cleared her throat and stepped back. "Sit down," she said. "Let me fix that bandage before you bleed all over the floor." This time he listened, but as she cleaned the wound and wrapped fresh cloth around his head, she was acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the way his eyes tracked her movements, of the fact that her hands were steadier than they'd been the first time she'd done this. They'd both changed since that night. The question was whether they'd changed enough. The answer came 3 days later, though not in the way either of them expected. Alara was in the garden, a small plot she'd started behind the house trying to coax vegetables out of the stubborn earth, when she heard horses approaching, multiple riders moving fast. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun. 5 men, maybe 6. As they got closer, she recognized Carter at the front of the group, his face red even from a distance. Her stomach dropped. She dropped the hoe and ran for the barn where Rowan was working. He saw her coming and immediately knew something was wrong. He met her halfway, wiping his hands on his pants. "Carter?" she said, pointing toward the approaching riders. "He brought others." Rowan's expression hardened. He looked toward the house, calculating, then back at her. "Inside. Now." "I'm not hiding. Alara, I'm not hiding," she repeated more firmly. He looked like he wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. The riders were already pulling up in front of the house, dust swirling around the horses' legs. Carter dismounted first, followed by the others. Alara recognized two of them from town, young ranch hands who worked for various spreads in the area. The other three were strangers, rough-looking men with the kind of hardness that came from violence, not weather. "Cade," Carter called out, "we need to talk." Rowan didn't respond. He positioned himself slightly in front of Alara and waited. Carter walked closer, the other men fanning out behind him. "See, there's been some discussion in town about you and your situation, and we've come to a decision." Rowan still didn't speak. "The way we see it," Carter continued, "this whole arrangement was built on fraud. You claimed to be deaf and disabled, took sympathy and charity from folks who thought you needed it. Then suddenly you get yourself a wife, and everything's better. That's mighty convenient." "He was deaf," Alara said, "and he was suffering. I saw it myself." "You saw what he wanted you to see," Carter shot back. "But that's besides the point now. The point is, the bet's still on. And part of that bet was that any woman could be bought for the right price and kept. You staying proves me right. But there's been some talk that maybe the purchase wasn't legitimate. Maybe you're staying out of fear, or because you don't know any better. So we're here to settle it." "Settle what?" Alara demanded. Carter smiled. "Whether you're here by choice or by force. And if it's by choice, well, proves you can be bought, which means I win. And if it's by force, then we're liberating you. Either way, the bet gets resolved." Rowan's hands curled into fists. He pulled out the slate he'd been carrying and wrote quickly, then held it up. "She stays by choice. Now leave." "See, that's what you say," Carter replied. "But how do we know that's true? How do we know you haven't been threatening her, forcing her?" "Because I'm standing right here telling you I choose to stay," Alara said, her voice sharp. "I choose this. I choose him. Now get off our land." "Our land? Oh," one of the strangers repeated mockingly. "Listen to her, acting like she owns something." "She does," Rowan said, his voice rough but clear. Everyone froze. Carter's eyes widened. "What did you say?" Rowan's jaw was tight, blood starting to seep through his bandage again, but he spoke anyway. "She owns this. Half of everything. Made it legal last week." It was a lie. They hadn't made anything legal, but Carter didn't know that, and the confidence in Rowan's voice sold it. Carter's face went purple. "You're lying." "Check the county records," Rowan said, the words costing him visible effort. "Half the ranch, half the livestock, all legal." "You can't do that," Carter sputtered. "She's your wife, your property." "She's my partner," Rowan interrupted, "and you're trespassing." For a moment, Carter looked like he might actually explode. Then he regained control, his expression shifting to something uglier. "Fine. Let's say that's true. Let's say you signed over half your ranch to this woman you bought for $50. That just proves you're a fool. And it doesn't change the fact that she was purchased. That's what the bet was about, whether a woman could be bought and kept. And here she is. Kept." "I'm not kept," Alara said. "I'm choosing this." "Sure you are. Just like you chose to be sold by your father. Just like you chose to marry a man you'd never met." Carter took a step closer. "Face it, Mrs. Cade. You had no choice then, and you got no real choice now. You're stuck here because you got nowhere else to go. That's not choice. That's just survival." Something snapped inside Alara. All the anger she'd been holding back, all the humiliation and rage and helplessness, it came flooding out. "You want to know about choice?" she said, her voice deadly calm. "Fine. I chose to stay when I found out about the bet. I chose to pull a creature out of my husband's ear that had been torturing him for years, while you and everyone else in town did nothing. I chose to stand up to you in the general store. I chose to build a life here. And I'm choosing right now to tell you that if you ever set foot on this property again, I will shoot you myself." The words hung in the air like a challenge. One of the strangers laughed. "You don't even have a gun." Rowan moved, fast despite his condition. He went to the porch and returned a moment later with a rifle, which he handed to Alara without hesitation. She took it, checked that it was loaded, and leveled it at Carter. Her hands didn't shake. "You were saying?" she asked. Carter's smile disappeared. "You won't shoot." "You willing to bet on that?" Alara asked. "Because you already made one bet about me, and look how that turned out. I'm still here, I'm still standing, and I'm done being the punchline to your joke." For several long seconds, nobody moved. The tension was thick enough to cut. Then Carter stepped back. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Rowan said, his voice stronger now despite the blood running down his neck. "You lost the bet the moment she chose to stay. And you're losing now. Take your men and leave." Carter looked between them, his face twisted with fury and something that might have been grudging respect. Then he turned and mounted his horse. "Come on," he said to the others. They rode off, slower this time, Carter looking back once before they disappeared over the rise. Alara lowered the rifle, her arms suddenly weak. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving her shaky and cold. Rowan took the rifle from her gently and set it aside. Then he pulled her into his arms. It was the first time he'd held her, really held her, not just a hand on her shoulder or a brief touch. His arms were solid around her, his heart hammering against her ear, and she realized he'd been just as terrified as she was. "I would have shot him," she said into his chest. "I know," Rowan replied, his voice rough. "That's why I gave you the gun." She pulled back to look at him. Blood was streaming down his face now, the effort of speaking so much having torn something open. But he was smiling, actually smiling. "You're bleeding everywhere," she said. "Worth it. That's becoming a habit with you. Only when it involves you." Alara felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been locked tight since the day she'd signed those papers in the general store. "Did you mean it?" she asked. "About making the ranch half mine?" "No," he admitted. "I lied. But I'll do it tomorrow if you want." "Should have done it already." "Why?" "Because you've earned it. Because it's right. Because—" He paused, struggling with the words. "Because I want you to stay. Not because you have to, because you want to." "I already want to," Alara said softly. "I know. But I want you to have the choice. Real choice. Not just survival." She reached up and touched his face, careful to avoid the bleeding ear. "You need to sit down before you pass out." "In a minute, Rowan. In a minute," he repeated. Then quieter. "Let me have this minute." So she did. They stood there in the yard with blood running down his neck and the sun beating down and the dust still settling from Carter's departure. And for that minute, nothing else mattered. When they finally went inside, Rowan collapsed into a chair while Alara gathered medical supplies. The wound was worse than any of the previous episodes, torn open by the strain of speaking so much. It took her nearly an hour to get the bleeding stopped and the area cleaned. By the time she finished, Rowan was gray with exhaustion and pain. She helped him to his bedroom and got him settled. "Sleep," she ordered. "I'll wake you if anything happens." He caught her hand before she could leave. "Stay. I need to clean up." "Stay," he repeated. "Please." Alara looked at him, at the raw vulnerability in his eyes, and made a decision. She sat down on the edge of the bed. Rowan shifted over, making room, and she lay down beside him. It was strange and intimate and slightly terrifying, but it also felt right in a way nothing else had. His hand found hers in the space between them, fingers intertwining. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for choosing me." "Thank you for being worth choosing," she replied. He fell asleep holding her hand, his breathing evening out as the pain medication she'd given him took effect. Alara lay awake beside him, watching the way the late afternoon light filtered through the window, painting patterns on the wall. Everything had changed, again. The line between obligation and choice, between transaction and partnership, between strangers and something more. It had blurred beyond recognition. She didn't know what happened next. Didn't know if Carter would come back, if Rowan's hearing would continue to improve, if this fragile thing they were building could survive in a world determined to see it as a joke. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't leaving. Not now, not ever. This was her home, her choice, her life. And she was done apologizing for it. The next morning, Alara woke to find Rowan already up and gone. She found him outside, hitching the wagon. "What are you doing?" she asked. He turned, and she saw he'd changed the bandage himself. It was slightly crooked, but functional. "Going to town," he said, the words still rough but clearer than yesterday. "To the county office, making it legal." "Making what legal?" "Half the ranch. Your name on the deed." He paused. "If you want it." Alara felt her throat tighten. "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do. I lied to Carter about it being done. I won't lie to you." He stepped closer. "I want you to have it. I want you to know you're staying because it's yours, not mine. Ours." She looked at him, this man who'd been a stranger a month ago, who'd been bought and sold in the same transaction that had bought and sold her, who'd suffered in silence for years until she'd pulled the source of his pain out with her own hands. "All right, but," she said, "let's go make it legal." They rode into town together, sitting close on the wagon bench. People stared as they passed, whispers following them down the street, but neither of them looked away or showed shame. The county office was a small building near the church, run by a tired-looking man named Morrison, who eyed them with suspicion when they explained what they wanted. "You want to put your wife's name on the deed," Morrison said slowly. "That's unusual." "Is it illegal?" Rowan asked. "No, but..." "Then do it." Morrison shrugged and pulled out the necessary papers. It took less than an hour to complete the transaction, Alara's signature going beside Rowan's on the deed. When Morrison handed her the copy, she stared at it for a long moment. Her name. On legal documents that meant something. Proof that she owned part of something real. "Thank you," she said to Rowan as they left. He took her hand. Right there in the middle of town, in front of everyone who wanted to judge them. "Thank you for staying." They were halfway to the wagon when a familiar voice called out, "Well, well, making it official, are we?" "Oh boy. Carter. Of course. He was standing outside the saloon with several other men, all of them watching the scene with varying degrees of amusement. Rowan's hand tightened on Alara's, but he didn't stop walking. "I heard about your little property transfer," Carter called. "Real touching. Of course, it doesn't change anything. She's still here because she was bought. Still here because she had nowhere else to go." Alara stopped walking. Rowan tried to pull her forward, but she shook her head and turned to face Carter. "You're right," she said clearly. "I had nowhere else to go. My father sold me to clear a debt. I came here with nothing. No choice, no options, no future. You made sure of that with your bet." Carter's smile widened. "Finally admitting it." "I'm not done," Alara said. "I had nowhere else to go. But that's not why I stayed. I stayed because I found something here worth more than $50 or $100 or all the money in the world. I found a partnership. I found respect. I found someone who sees me as more than property or a burden or a joke. And yes, I found love." The word hung in the air. Rowan's eyes widened. Alara felt her face heat, but she didn't take it back. "So you can keep your bet," she continued. "You can tell yourself you won if it makes you feel better, but the truth is, you lost the moment you thought people could be bought and kept like livestock. Because we're not your property. We're not your entertainment. We're just two people who found each other in the worst possible way and made something real out of it anyway. And that's worth more than anything you'll ever understand." She turned back to Rowan. "Can we go home now?" "Ush." He was staring at her like she'd just performed another miracle. Slowly, he nodded. They climbed into the wagon and rode away, leaving Carter and his audience behind. They were almost back to the ranch when Rowan pulled the wagon to a stop. He set the brake and turned to face her. "Did you mean it?" he asked. "What you said, about love." Alara's heart hammered. She'd said it in anger and defiance to prove a point to Carter. But now, Looking at Rowan's face, seeing the hope and fear warring in his expression, she realized the truth. "Yes," she said. "I meant it. I don't deserve it." "Probably not. But you're getting it anyway." He reached for her hand, his rough fingers gentle against hers. "I love you too. I don't know when it happened. Maybe when you stayed after learning about the bet. Maybe when you threatened Carter in the general store. Maybe when you held that rifle like you actually would have shot him." He paused. "Maybe it was always going to happen, from the moment you pulled that creature out of my head and saved my life." Alara felt tears prickling at her eyes. "We're a mess, you know that?" "I know. This whole thing is backwards and wrong and started from the worst possible place." "I know that too. But I love you anyway." Rowan smiled, and this time when he pulled her close and kissed her, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just two people who'd chosen each other against all odds, all logic, all common sense. And when they finally pulled apart, Alara looked at the man she'd married as a stranger and saw her future looking back. It wasn't the future she'd imagined. It wasn't easy or simple or anything like what she'd been taught to want, but it was hers. Theirs. Built from nothing, earned through pain and choice and stubborn refusal to let the world define what they could be. And that made it perfect. They rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, Rowan's hand covering hers on the wagon bench. The land stretched out around them, familiar now in ways it hadn't been when Alara first arrived. She knew which section of fence needed mending, which pasture held the best grazing, where the well water ran sweetest. This place had become hers not through ownership papers, though those helped, but through the slow accumulation of knowledge that came from actually living somewhere. When they pulled up to the house, Rowan helped her down and then stood there for a moment, just looking at her. "What?" she asked. "Still can't believe you're real," he said. "Still can't believe you stayed." "Get used to it. I'm not going anywhere." His smile was crooked, made imperfect by the bandage still wrapped around his head. "Good." The days that followed settled into something that felt almost like peace. Rowan's hearing continued to improve, though it remained unpredictable. Some mornings he woke able to hear nearly everything. Other days the silence returned, thick and absolute. The bleeding episodes became less frequent, his body finally adjusting to the restoration of a sense it had lost decades ago. They learned to communicate in the spaces between sound and silence, using the slate when necessary, but relying more often on the kind of wordless understanding that came from actually paying attention to each other. Alara learned to read his expressions, the set of his shoulders when he was frustrated, the slight tilt of his head when he was listening hard for sounds that might or might not come. Rowan learned her rhythms, when she needed quiet and when she needed to talk through her thoughts, when her anger was surface level and when it ran deep enough to require addressing. It wasn't perfect. They argued, sometimes viciously, about everything from how to manage the ranch finances to whose turn it was to feed the chickens. But the arguments felt different than the cold silences of their early days together. They felt like the kind of friction that came from two people actually building something together, not just existing in proximity. 3 weeks after the confrontation with Carter, Alara was in town alone picking up supplies when she ran into Mrs. Halford outside the general store. The older woman's expression was its usual mixture of disdain and curiosity. "Mrs. Cade," she said, her voice dripping false courtesy, "how is your husband?" "He's well, thank you," Alara replied, keeping her tone neutral. "I heard the most interesting rumor, something about him getting his hearing back. Is that true?" Alara hesitated. The truth was complicated, and she didn't particularly want to share it with someone who'd take it straight back to the gossip mill. But lying felt worse. "Partially," she said. "It's improving." Mrs. Halford's eyebrows rose. How extraordinary. After all these years, one might almost think it was a miracle. The word hung between them, loaded with implications Alara didn't like. "One might also think," Alara said carefully, "that having a creature removed from your ear canal after decades might allow some healing to occur, but I suppose miracle sounds better for gossip." Mrs. Halford's expression soured. "There's no need to be crude. There's no need to spread rumors about my husband's medical condition either, but that hasn't stopped anyone." "Well, I suppose you would be defensive, given the circumstances of your marriage." Alara felt the old anger flare, but she pushed it down. She was tired of defending herself to people who had already made up their minds. "The circumstances of my marriage are my business," she said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have supplies to collect." She moved past Mrs. Halford and into the store, her hands shaking slightly. The store owner nodded to her, more respectful now than he'd been in previous visits. Word had spread about the property deed, about the confrontation with Carter, about Alara standing her ground with a loaded rifle. It hadn't made her popular, but it had earned her a certain grudging respect. She gathered what she needed and paid, then loaded everything into the wagon. She was about to climb up when she heard familiar voices coming from the alley beside the general store. "Telling you, something's not right about it." Carter's voice. Alara froze. "He was deaf for 30 years, another man replied. "You don't just get over that." "Exactly, which means either he was faking it all along or something else is going on. And I intend to find out what." Alara's stomach tightened. She moved closer to the alley, staying out of sight. "What difference does it make?" the other man asked. "You lost the bet. Let it go." "I didn't lose," Carter said, his voice sharp. "She's still there, isn't she? Still living on that ranch, still playing house with him. That proves my point. A woman can be bought and kept if the price is right. She loves him. She said so herself. She says a lot of things. Doesn't make them true. I think she's trapped out there and too proud to admit it. And if that's the case, then someone needs to intervene." Alara's hands curled into fists. She wanted to step into the alley and confront him, but something held her back. Better to know what he was planning than to stop him from talking. "Intervene how?" the other man asked, sounding skeptical. "I'm still working that out, but mark my words, this isn't over." "That woman deserves better than what she got, even if she doesn't know it yet." The conversation shifted to other topics, and Alara moved away before they could spot her. She climbed into the wagon and started for home, her mind racing. Carter wasn't going to let this go. He'd convinced himself he was some kind of savior, that Alara needed rescuing from a situation she'd already chosen. The arrogance of it made her furious, but the threat was real. Men like Carter didn't give up easily, especially when their pride was wounded. She needed to tell Rowan. When she got back to the ranch, she found him in the barn, working on repairing a broken stall door. He looked up when she entered, immediately reading the tension in her posture. "What happened?" His voice was rough, but clear enough. Alara told him about the conversation she'd overheard, watching his expression darken as she spoke. "He won't give up," Rowan said when she finished. "Men like him never do." "So what do we do?" Rowan set down his tools and came over to her. "We prepare. Make sure the rifle's loaded. Keep watch. And we don't give him any excuse to claim we're doing something wrong. He doesn't need an excuse. He'll make one up." "I know." Rowan's jaw tightened. "But we're not alone anymore. You have your name on the deed. We have legal standing, and people in town are starting to see through his nonsense, even if they won't say so out loud." Alara wanted to believe that, but she'd seen too much of human nature to trust it. People believed what they wanted to believe, and Carter was good at telling them what they wanted to hear. That night they ate supper with the rifle propped against the wall beside the table. It felt like a declaration of war, even though neither of them said so out loud. After the meal, Rowan reached for the slate and wrote, "If it comes to it, if Carter tries something, you leave, take the horses and go." Alara grabbed the chalk. "I'm not leaving you. You have to. If something happens to me, you'll still have half the ranch. You can sell it, start over somewhere else." "I don't want to start over somewhere else. I want to be here. With you." Rowan stared at the words for a long moment, then erased them and wrote, "I can't lose you." "Then we make sure he doesn't win," Alara wrote back. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the unspoken threat hanging over them. Finally, Rowan stood and held out his hand. "Come with me," he said. Alara took his hand and let him lead her outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. They walked to the top of the small rise behind the house, where you could see for miles in every direction. "When I was a boy," Rowan said, his voice quiet, "before the sickness that took my hearing, my father used to bring me up here. He'd point out the boundaries of our land and tell me that someday it would all be mine, that I'd build something here that mattered. He paused, looking out at the horizon. I thought I'd failed, he continued. Thought that losing my hearing meant I'd lost any chance of building the life he'd imagined. Spent years just surviving, just getting through each day. Never thought I'd have more than that. Alara squeezed his hand. And then you came, he said, turning to look at her. And everything changed. You gave me back more than my hearing. You gave me a reason to fight, a reason to want more than just survival. You gave me that too, Alara said. You gave me a choice. Real choice. Not just the illusion of it. They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon, watching the land they'd both claimed turn dark. And Alara thought about how strange it was that the worst transaction of her life had led to the best thing in it. How being bought for $50 had somehow resulted in finding something priceless. But she also knew that precious things were worth protecting. And if Carter wanted a fight, he was going to get one. The confrontation came 2 days later at noon when the sun was high and brutal. Alara was hanging laundry when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon. More riders, maybe a dozen this time. Her heart started pounding, but she forced herself to stay calm. She walked to the barn where Rowan was working and touched his shoulder. He turned, saw her expression, and immediately understood. Together they walked to the front of the house and waited. Carter led the group, just as she'd expected. But this time he'd brought more than just ranch hands. Alara recognized the county sheriff, a thin man named Douglas, who generally tried to stay out of disputes. There were also several townspeople, including the general store owner, and surprisingly, Mrs. Halford. The riders pulled to a stop in front of the house. Carter dismounted first, followed by Sheriff Douglas. Cade, the sheriff said, his voice weary, we need to have a conversation. About what? Rowan's voice was steady. About your wife. There's been concerns raised about her well-being. By who? Alara demanded. Carter stepped forward. By people who care about what happens to you. We've heard troubling things, Mrs. Cade. Stories about violence, about threats, about you being kept against your will. That's a lie, Alara said flatly. Is it? Then explain why you threatened me with a rifle. Explain why you're isolated out here, cut off from town, from your family. I threatened you because you were trespassing and harassing us. And I'm not isolated. I come to town regularly. I choose to be here. Do you? Carter's voice was gentle, almost pitying. Or is that what you've been told to say? Sheriff Douglas cleared his throat. Mrs. Cade, I need to ask you some questions, just to make sure everything's all right. Everything is fine, Alara said. Then you won't mind answering a few questions, privately. Alara felt Rowan tense beside her. This was the trap. Get her alone, ask leading questions, twist her answers into evidence of coercion. I do mind, she said. Anything you need to ask, you can ask in front of my husband. That's not proper procedure. I don't care about procedure. I care about not being manipulated into saying something that can be used against us. Sheriff Douglas looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, I'm just trying to do my job. Your job is to protect people, not to harass them based on lies from a man who lost a bet and can't accept it. This isn't about a bet, Carter interjected. This is about your welfare. You were sold by your father, bought for $50, and brought out here to live with a man you didn't know. That's not a marriage. That's slavery. It was slavery, Alara agreed, when it started, when I had no choice and no power. But that's not what it is now. Now I own half this ranch. Now I have legal rights. Now I stay because I want to, not because I have to. So you say, but how do we know that's true? How do we know he hasn't threatened you? Told you what to say. Rowan stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the assembled crowd with a strength Alara had never heard from him before. You want to know if she's here by choice? Then ask yourself why she stayed after she learned about your bet. Ask yourself why she stood up to you in town. Ask yourself why she put her name on that deed when she could have taken the money I offered her and left. His hearing must have been particularly good today because he turned his head slightly, tracking the murmurs running through the crowd. You want to call me a liar? He continued. Fine. I've lied. I let you all believe I was helpless when I was just suffering. I took sympathy I didn't deserve and charity that should have gone to others. I participated in a cruel bet because I was lonely and desperate and didn't think anyone would actually go through with it. Alara reached for his hand, but he shook his head and kept talking. But I'm not lying now. I love my wife. She loves me. And what we built together, we built from nothing, from the worst possible start. And if that offends you, if you can't accept that people can change and grow and make something real out of something broken, then that's your failing, not ours. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Sheriff Douglas spoke. Mrs. Cade, do you have anything to add to that? Alara looked at the assembled crowd. At Carter, whose face had gone red with anger. At Mrs. Halford, who looked torn between disapproval and reluctant admiration. At the sheriff, who just looked tired. Yes, she said. I have something to add. She turned to fully face the crowd, making sure everyone could hear her. When I came here, I was property. I'd been sold to settle a debt, and I had no say in any of it. And you're right, that was wrong. It was cruel and unjust, and I had every right to be angry about it. I still do. She felt Rowan tense beside her, but she kept going. But here's what you don't understand. Being angry about how something starts doesn't mean you can't make something good out of it anyway. Being a victim once doesn't mean you have to stay a victim forever. And choosing to build a life with someone, even when that choice comes after the worst possible beginning, doesn't make you weak or deluded or trapped. She pointed at Carter. You think you're saving me. You think you're doing something noble by trying to rescue me from a situation you created. But I don't need rescuing. What I needed was a choice, real choice. And I have that now. I chose to stay. I chose to love him. I chose this life. And no amount of you trying to invalidate that choice is going to change it. But, Carter started. I'm not finished, Alara said sharply. You made a bet about whether a woman could be bought and kept. And you're so focused on the buying part that you've completely missed the point. Yes, I was bought. Yes, that was wrong. But I wasn't kept. I chose to stay. And that choice, that agency, that power to decide my own future, that's what you can't understand. Because understanding it would mean admitting that you don't have power over me, that you never did. She took a breath, steadying herself. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave my property. You're going to stop spreading lies about my husband and my marriage. And you're going to accept that you lost. Not just the bet, but any claim you ever had to authority over my life. And if I don't? Carter asked. Then I'll sue you for harassment, Alara said calmly. I'll make a formal complaint with the sheriff. I'll tell everyone in town exactly what you did, how you orchestrated this whole thing, how you're so desperate to be right that you'll torment two people trying to build a life together. And I'll make sure everyone knows that the big, powerful Carter, who thinks he can control women's lives, couldn't even win a bet against a poor farmer's daughter. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Carter's face went from red to purple. Sheriff Douglas held up a hand for silence. That's enough. Mrs. Cade has made her position clear. Carter, unless you have actual evidence of wrongdoing, and I mean evidence, not suspicions, this matter is closed. But closed, Douglas repeated firmly. Now everyone mount up. We're leaving. Carter looked like he wanted to argue, but the crowd was already turning away. Even his own supporters looked uncomfortable now, embarrassed to be part of what was clearly a failed attempt at heroics. Mrs. Halford, surprisingly, approached Alara before leaving. I misjudged you, she said quietly. I thought you were just another foolish girl who'd gotten herself into trouble, but you're stronger than that. I'm not that strong, Alara replied honestly. I'm just stubborn. Mrs. Halford almost smiled. Sometimes that's the same thing. She turned and walked back to her horse, leaving Alara standing beside Rowan as the crowd dispersed. Carter was the last to leave, his eyes burning with humiliation and rage. This isn't over, he said quietly. Yes, Rowan replied, his voice clear and strong. It is. They watched him ride away, dust trailing behind his horse. When the last rider disappeared over the horizon, Alara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. That was, she started. Rowan pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. That was incredible. You were incredible. I was terrified. You didn't show it. Alara pulled back to look at him. His face was streaked with sweat, and she could see blood starting to seep through his bandage again. The effort of speaking so much, so loudly, had taken its toll. Inside, she ordered, now. He didn't argue. By the time she got the bleeding stopped and a fresh bandage applied, they were both exhausted. They sat at the kitchen table in silence, the adrenaline slowly draining away. Finally, Rowan reached for the slate and wrote, "Do you think he'll actually stop?" Alara took the chalk. "I don't know. But we made our position clear, and the sheriff backed us up. That counts for something. What if it's not enough? Then we deal with it. Together." Rowan stared at those last words for a long time. Then he set the slate aside and reached across the table to take both her hands in his. "I never thought I'd have this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "A partner. Someone who'd stand beside me. Someone who'd fight for us." "Neither did I," Alara admitted. "I thought I'd end up alone. Or worse, trapped in a marriage where I didn't matter, where I was just there." "You matter," Rowan said fiercely. "You matter more than anything." They sat there holding hands as the afternoon light shifted through the window, marking the passage of time in the way it always did out here. Steady, relentless, unconcerned with human drama. The weeks that followed were quiet. Carter stayed away. Whether out of genuine acceptance or just wounded pride, Alara didn't know and didn't care. The town's gossip shifted to other scandals, other entertainment. Life went on. Rowan's hearing continued to improve, though it never returned completely. He could hear some things clearly, others only as muffled sounds, and there were days when the silence returned entirely. But he adapted, and they adapted together, learning to communicate in whatever way worked in the moment. The ranch thrived under their joint management. Alara's garden produced more than expected, and Rowan's careful husbandry of the livestock paid off with healthy calves and good wool yields. They weren't wealthy, but they were stable, secure. One evening, about 2 months after the confrontation with Carter, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Rowan spoke. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About the bet. About how it started, about what it meant." Alara tensed slightly. "What about it?" Carter thought he could prove that anyone could be bought. That money could control people. And in a way, he was right. Your father sold you, I paid for you, and that transaction happened whether either of us wanted it or not. "I know," Alara said quietly. "But what he didn't understand," Rowan continued, "was that being bought and being kept are two different things. He could arrange the first, but he had no power over the second. That was always your choice. And I chose you." "You chose yourself," Rowan corrected gently. "You chose to take a terrible situation and make it into something you could live with. Then you chose to make it into something more. I was just lucky enough to be part of that choice." Alara felt tears prick her eyes. "That's not how I see it." "I know, but it's true anyway." He took her hand. "You saved my life, Alara. Not just by pulling that creature out of my ear. You saved it by showing me that even the worst beginning doesn't have to determine the ending. That people can change. That choice matters more than circumstance." "You showed me that too," she said. "You gave me back my choice when you offered me that $50. You could have kept me trapped, but you didn't. You gave me the power to leave, which meant that staying actually meant something." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky fade from gold to purple to deep blue. Stars began to appear, scattered across the darkness like seeds waiting to grow. "Do you ever regret it?" Rowan asked quietly. "Staying? No," Alara said without hesitation. "Do you regret asking me to?" "Never." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and the faint sweetness of the flowering plants in her garden. "I love you," she said. His hearing must have been good in that moment because he responded immediately. "I love you too." And sitting there on the porch of the ranch they owned together, built from nothing and choice and stubborn refusal to let cruelty define them, Alara understood something fundamental about the nature of freedom. It wasn't about circumstances. It wasn't about where you started or who tried to control you or what limitations you faced. Freedom was about choice, about taking whatever power you had, however small, and using it to shape your own life. She'd been bought for $50, but she'd bought herself back with courage and love and the simple act of staying when she could have left. And in doing so, she'd helped Rowan buy himself back too, from isolation, from pain, from the belief that he was unworthy of being chosen. They'd saved each other, not in some grand dramatic gesture, but in the small daily acts of choosing each other, of fighting for each other, of building something real out of the wreckage of a cruel bet that was worth more than any amount of money could measure. The following spring, Alara's garden flourished beyond anything she'd imagined. The vegetables came in strong and healthy, and she started selling surplus at the market in town. People who'd once whispered about her now nodded in respect when she passed. The quality of her produce spoke for itself, and in a place where results mattered more than reputation, that counted for something. Rowan's hearing stabilized at about 70% in his recovered ear. He could follow conversations, hear the sounds of the ranch, catch the nuances of Alara's voice when she spoke. The other ear remained deaf, but he'd learned to compensate, and the constant pain that had plagued him for decades was gone. They expanded the ranch slowly, carefully, buying a few more head of cattle and improving the irrigation for the garden. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would put them at risk, just steady growth built on solid work. One afternoon, Alara was at the market when she saw Carter across the square. He saw her too, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then, to her surprise, he walked over. "Mrs. Cade," he said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Carter," she replied neutrally. He was quiet for a moment, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he wasn't sure what to say. Finally, he spoke. "I owe you an apology." Alara raised her eyebrows. "Do you?" "I do. I convinced myself I was helping you, that I was doing something noble, but I was really just trying to prove I was right, trying to win a bet I should never have made in the first place." "You're apologizing now? After months?" "It took me that long to see it clearly," he admitted. "Took me watching you build something real while I was still stewing over being wrong. You were right, about everything. And I was a fool." Alara studied him, trying to gauge if this was genuine or just another manipulation. But his expression was sincere, his eyes meeting hers without the usual bravado. "I appreciate the apology," she said carefully, "but it doesn't change what you did. The bet, the harassment, the attempt to invalidate my choices, that all happened. Words don't undo that." "I know, but I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what you built. And I'm sorry I tried to tear it down." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, you're the strongest person I've ever met, and Cade's a lucky man." "No," Alara said, "we're both lucky, because we chose each other." Carter nodded slowly, then walked away. Alara stood there for a moment, processing the conversation. She didn't forgive him. Forgiveness would take time, if it came at all. But she recognized the apology for what it was, an admission of defeat. Carter had finally accepted that he'd lost, not just the bet, but the larger battle over who got to define her life. That evening, she told Rowan about the encounter. "Do you believe him?" he asked. "I think he believes himself," Alara said. "Whether that translates to actual change, I don't know, but it felt like closure." Rowan nodded. "Good. You deserve that." They were sitting at the kitchen table, the remains of supper between them. The lamp cast warm light across the room, making shadows dance on the walls. Outside, the evening sounds of the ranch filtered through the open window, chickens settling for the night, horses moving in the corral, the wind rustling through the trees they'd planted near the house. "I've been thinking," Alara said, "about the future, about what we want to build here." "What do you want?" Rowan asked. Alara thought about it. When she'd first arrived, she'd wanted nothing more than to survive. Then she'd wanted dignity, respect, choice. She'd achieved all of that. But what came next? "I want to help other women," she said slowly. "Women in situations like mine was. Women who've been sold or trapped or told they have no choices. I want them to know that you can build something real even from the worst beginning. That choice matters, even when it feels like you have none." Rowan was quiet for a moment, then he said, "We could offer work. Women who need to leave bad situations, who need a place to stay while they figure things out. We have the space. We could pay fair wages. Alara felt something warm bloom in her chest. You'd do that? Why not? This place gave us both a second chance. Why shouldn't it give others the same? They talked late into the night, planning and dreaming and imagining what they could build. Not just a ranch, but a refuge. A place where being bought didn't have to mean being kept, where choice was respected and protected. It would take time, resources, careful planning, but they had all of those things now. They had stability and purpose and each other. Most importantly, they had proof that change was possible, that the worst beginnings could lead to the best endings if you were willing to fight for them. As summer turned to fall, they put their plans into action. The first woman who came to them was young, barely 20, fleeing a marriage her parents had arranged to a man 3 times her age. She stayed for 2 months working in the garden and learning to manage accounts. When she left, it was with money in her pocket and the name of a family in the next county who needed a bookkeeper. Others followed. Not many, they couldn't afford to help everyone, but enough to make a difference. Each woman who passed through their ranch left with more than she'd arrived with: skills, money, confidence, proof that they could survive on their own terms. And each time someone left to start a new life, Alara felt a piece of her own healing complete. She couldn't undo what had been done to her, couldn't erase the humiliation of being sold or the cruelty of the bet, but she could make sure that suffering led to something meaningful, that her pain translated to someone else's freedom. That was worth everything. 2 years after Alara had first arrived at the ranch, she stood on the porch watching the sunset with Rowan beside her. The ranch had grown, more land, more livestock, a new barn they'd built together. The garden had expanded into a small commercial operation, supplying 3 towns with fresh produce. But more than that, the ranch had become something bigger than just a place to live. It had become a statement, proof that people could reclaim their lives from circumstances that tried to define them, that being bought didn't mean being owned, that love could grow in the most unlikely places. Do you ever think about how it started? Alara asked. Sometimes, Rowan admitted. Not as much as I used to. Does it still bother you? The bet? The way we came together? He was quiet for a moment, considering. It bothers me that it happened that way, that you had to go through that I was part of something so cruel, but I can't regret where it led. Does that make me a hypocrite? No, Alara said. It makes you human. We can hate how something started and still value what it became. She leaned against him, feeling his arm come around her shoulders. The gesture was so natural now, so automatic, that she sometimes forgot there was a time when they barely touched, when the distance between them felt insurmountable. I'm proud of us, she said. Of what we built. Not just the ranch, but everything. The marriage, the partnership, the life we made. I'm proud of you, Rowan replied. You did the hard part. You chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. You chose to build when destroying would have been justified. You chose love when hate would have made more sense. We both made those choices. Maybe, but you made them first. You showed me it was possible. They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant colors that would fade to darkness soon enough. But in that moment, watching the light play across the land they'd claimed together, Alara felt something she'd never expected to feel when she first arrived at this ranch. She felt home. Not because of the building or the land or even the life they'd built, but because of the choice. The daily, deliberate choice to be here, to love this man, to build this life. That choice, renewed every morning when she woke up beside him and every evening when they sat together watching the sunset, was the foundation of everything. It was stronger than any deed or contract or legal document. It was the thing that transformed a transaction into a marriage, a house into a home, survival into purpose. She'd been bought for $50, but she'd bought herself back with something infinitely more valuable, the simple, powerful act of choosing to stay. And in that choice, she'd found not just love, but freedom. The kind of freedom that came not from being unbound, but from binding yourself to something worth holding on to. Years later, when people asked how they'd made their marriage work despite its terrible beginning, Alara would always say the same thing. We chose each other. Every day we keep choosing each other. And that choice matters more than how we started. It was the truest thing she knew, the lesson she'd learned the hard way, through pain and anger and stubbornness and love. That in the end, we are not defined by what's done to us. We are defined by what we choose to do with it, and she had chosen well.